On October 13, 1977, inside St. Andrew's Hospital in Northampton, a 96-year-old woman died under a name few nurses recognized. Decades earlier, society pages called her the most beautiful woman in Europe, a muse with eyes painters tried to steal, a mind Marcel Proust praised. Her childhood began with a Keynes gunshot scandal in 1892. Her adulthood ended with a face altered by paraffin beauty injections and a marriage that turned a palace into a prison. How does a life that started in salons and Blenheim's gold corridors end in silence behind institutional doors? And when old money makes beauty a currency, who pays when the mirror finally refuses to flatter? To understand why Gladys Deacon's life could swing from worship to exile, the camera has to pull back to the social machine that produced her, the late 19th and early 20th century Atlantic world, where money, titles, and publicity formed a single marketplace. In the Gilded Age, American industrial fortunes rose faster than old European estates could sustain themselves. Cash-rich families in New York and Boston bought entry into aristocratic circles that were land-rich but debt-starved. In return, dukes and counts offered a crest, a seat at court, and the illusion of permanence. Newspapers, newly hungry for human drama, turned this exchange into entertainment, printing dowry figures like sports scores, ranking beauties like racehorses, and treating a woman's reputation as a public asset that could be bid up or destroyed overnight. What did that do to a young woman raised inside that spotlight? And what happens when the story the world wants is more valuable than the person living it? The era produced a repeating cast of contradictions. Jenny Jerome, the American heiress who stepped into British power circles and became a magnet for rumor. Anna Gould, a railroad titan's daughter whose fortune made her eligible even when society columns mocked her looks. Arabella Huntington, who climbed from poverty into a dynasty built on railroads and real estate. And Gladys Deacon, whose beauty was treated less like a trait and more like a national resource. In that ecosystem, women were praised as icons but managed like mergers, expected to embody refinement while being denied true control over money, marriage, and even their own faces. The double standard was brutal. A powerful man's affairs could be recast as romance, while a woman's suspected independence became a moral trial staged for public consumption. And because photography and gossip traveled faster than personal truth, identity itself became fragile. One headline could fossilize a person into a caricature. Modern audiences recognize the pattern instantly. Victorian rumor works like today's screenshot culture. Beauty hierarchies look like algorithmic ratings, and a private mistake becomes a permanent public brand. So when Gladys chased an ideal, Greek profile perfection, a ducal title, a life that looked invincible, was it vanity alone, or was it the logical response to a system that rewarded women only when they could be displayed? And if old money is supposed to protect its own, why did it let one of its most celebrated symbols disappear? Gladys Marie Deacon entered the world on February 7, 1881 in Paris, already positioned at the crossroads of American money and European prestige, the exact fault line where old money and new ambition loved to trade with each other. Her parents, Edward Parker Deacon and Florence Baldwin, were Americans living in France, moving through a social orbit where dinners doubled as auditions and reputation functioned like currency. But the first lesson Gladys absorbed was not etiquette or French literature, it was volatility. In 1892, when she was only 11, the family detonated into public scandal after her father shot and killed her mother's lover in Cannes, a crime that ended in imprisonment and worldwide gossip. 1 year later, in 1893, her parents divorced, and Gladys was pushed into the strict protective architecture of a convent school at Auteuil, where silence and control replaced the chaos of adult desire. What happens to a child when the first headline of her life is violence, shame, and a family name dragged through the same society that once applauded it? And what happens when that child grows up learning that appearance is not decoration, but armor? After her father's release, the family's instability continued in a way that would later feel like a prophecy. Gladys was pulled back and forth between parents, countries, and stories, as if custody itself were another form of social leverage. Her father's mind began to fracture. He was hospitalized at McLean Hospital in Massachusetts and died there in 1901 when Gladys was about 20. The pattern was brutal. Men in her lineage could hold power, lose control, and be swallowed by institutions. How could a young woman living under that shadow ever believe that safety came from anything other than careful self-design? By the time Gladys and her sisters returned to France to live with their mother, the trauma had already hardened into a kind of ambition. If the world could strip a family of dignity in one scandal, then dignity had to be rebuilt in a stronger form. Beauty, intelligence, social mastery, and, if possible, a title that could outlast rumor. In Paris, Gladys became exactly the kind of figure the era was trained to worship. She was described as astonishingly beautiful, but what truly made her dangerous in elite rooms was the combination: beauty plus sharpness, charm plus observation, a young woman who did not simply shimmer, but listened. Writers and artists noticed. Marcel Proust would later describe her as possessing beauty and intelligence in rare proportion, the kind of compliment that turns a person into legend because it implies she is not only looked at, but recognized. Yet even praise in that world could be a trap. When society crowns someone the most beautiful, it quietly demands repayment. Remain perfect, remain desirable, remain worthy of the myth. Could a mind that survived scandal ever accept the idea of good enough when the world only rewarded extremes? This is where the old money mechanism begins to reveal itself. The culture treated women as symbols of refinement, of family success, of national glamour, but it denied them the one thing symbols are never allowed to have: freedom to age, to change, to be ordinary. In Gladys's case, the pressure focused on the most fragile surface of all, the face. Around 1903, when she was about 22, she reportedly tried to improve her already famous looks through paraffin wax injections to reshape her nose toward an idealized classical profile, an early, risky cosmetic practice that promised permanent perfection and often delivered irreversible damage. The decision sounds personal, even vain, until the era's logic is considered. If a woman's social value could rise or fall on the angle of her features, was this truly self-indulgence, or was it survival strategy in a beauty economy that never forgave flaws? And if a young woman had already watched a family name collapse, would she not cling harder to the one asset society insisted could protect her: physical perfection? But the most decisive force in Gladys's foundation was not cosmetics or poetry. It was the gravitational pull of aristocratic power. In the late 1990s, she was drawn into the orbit of Blenheim Palace, one of Britain's grandest ducal seats, and into the household of Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. There, she befriended Consuelo Vanderbilt, an American heiress whose marriage to the Duke had been engineered as an exchange: her fortune for his title, her youth for the restoration of a dynasty. Blenheim was the stage where America's new money learned how little it mattered once it crossed into old-world hierarchy. A duchess could live inside a palace and still be a hostage to protocol, expectation, and Cole's marital arithmetic. Gladys watched that closely. She watched how Consuelo's wealth could not buy tenderness, how grandeur could coexist with loneliness, how a marriage could be both triumph in photographs and disaster in private. So when Gladys set her sights on the Duke, what exactly was she pursuing? Love, victory, or the illusion of permanent safety that only a title seemed to provide? Over the next years, the relationship formed in the shadow of that first marriage, complicated by the Duke's status and Consuelo's presence. Gladys became the long-term fascination, the on-and-off mistress, the woman who waited at the edges of legitimacy while the world judged her either as romantic heroine or social climber, depending on which narrative sold better that week. The timeline itself reveals the cold patience of the pursuit. Consuelo separated from the Duke in 1906, and the legal and social machinery moved slowly. Only in 1921, after divorce, did Gladys become his second wife, by then about 40 years old. That number matters because it exposes the trade. She did not win the palace at 20. She spent 2 decades paying for it with waiting, with reputation, with the quiet cost of being a story whispered rather than a wife publicly honored. And by the time the title arrived, the aesthetic ideal she had chased earlier was already turning against her. The reported consequences of paraffin wax injections could distort a face over time as material shifted. The foundation of her tragedy becomes almost mathematical. Childhood scandal plus institutional fear, society worship plus impossible standards, proximity to a loveless dynastic marriage, and a lifelong fixation on a duke as the promised exit from insecurity. Were these red flags ignored because of love, or because ambition had been trained to feel like love? How does a fortune and title culture make a brilliant woman vulnerable not despite her gifts, but because those gifts are constantly priced, ranked, and negotiated? And when the prize is a palace, what happens when the palace finally shuts its doors from the inside? By the time Gladys Deacon finally became the Duchess of Marlborough in 1921, the story looked like a victory that could be framed and hung in every drawing room. The legendary beauty, the long pursuit, the ducal title, Blenheim Palace itself, a fortress of history that should have swallowed scandal and returned stability. But old money has a cruel habit. It rewards the performance of triumph, not the reality of peace. And once the cameras fade, the palace becomes less like a sanctuary and more like an echo chamber where every flaw grows louder. What happened next was not a single collapse, but a chain of humiliations, social, domestic, psychological, each one tightening around a woman who had spent her whole life trying to control how the world looked at her. The Duke, Charles Spencer Churchill, was older, hardened by public controversy and private coldness. His first marriage had been transactional and bitter, and the second was not built to heal it. Their household did not become a romantic rebirth, it became a standoff. In a society where a wife was expected to function as a symbol of dignity, Gladys was now trapped in a role where the symbol was no longer welcomed, especially as her appearance reportedly deteriorated over the years. Paraffin wax, unlike a rumor, doesn't disappear. It can migrate, harden, and deform. So when the thing that made Gladys socially valuable, the face that rooms once held their breath to admire, began to change into something unpredictable, what did that do to a woman whose entire strategy for safety had been built on being unassailable? In that environment, oddness becomes both symptom and weapon. Accounts from the period describe Gladys as increasingly eccentric, rigid, and volatile. She reportedly surrounded herself with pets, most famously spaniels, treating them as loyal beings in a world where loyalty from humans had always come with conditions. She is said to have allowed dogs to roam Blenheim's grand interiors, a detail that sounds almost comedic until it is read as rebellion. The palace demanded she behave as a polished ornament. She answered by letting the palace become messy, alive, and deliberately unmanageable. Was it carelessness, or a declaration that if she could not be loved in those rooms, she would at least refuse to be controlled by them? The breakdown deepened into scenes that made the aristocratic machine do what it always does when a woman becomes too much. It isolates her and rewrites her as the problem. Stories circulated of Gladys placing a gun on the dining table, a gesture of intimidation that, even if partly theatrical, signals something darker, the need to reclaim power in a house where she had none. In the logic of old money, a man can be tyrannical and still be a duke. A woman who becomes threatening is labeled unstable, scandalous, unfit. So the household responded with the only tool its class truly trusts: exclusion. Gradually, Gladys was pushed out of Blenheim's center, then out of its life, and effectively out of its identity. The cruelty lies not only in the expulsion, but in what expulsion means for a woman like her. If the palace was the destination, then being barred from it is not just a marital issue. It is the symbolic erasure of the entire life project. And without the palace, the title becomes a hollow sound. She did not simply lose a home, she lost the stage on which she had been promised legitimacy. Once separated from the Duke's world, Gladys drifted into a kind of social disappearance. She lived for a time under an assumed name, often recorded as Mrs. Spencer, as if even her own identity had become unsafe in public. Locals in rural England reportedly saw her as a strange figure, a woman who looked and behaved unlike the elegant duchess newspapers once described. Children mocked her, neighbors gossiped. The same society that had once mythologized her beauty now consumed her decline as another form of spectacle. How brutal is it that the crowd loves a woman most when she is either perfect or broken, but never when she is simply human? Here, the mechanism of collapse becomes clear. Old money does not only control wealth and titles, it controls narratives. When a woman no longer serves the narrative, when she cannot be presented as decorative proof of aristocratic stability, she becomes an embarrassment. And embarrassments are managed quietly, medically, administratively. In 1962, when Gladys was about 81, she was committed to St. Andrew's Hospital in Northampton, a psychiatric institution where she would spend the last 15 years of her life. The dates land like iron. 1881, born into prestige. 1892, family scandal. 1921, the title. 1962, institutionalization. 1977, death. A timeline like that is not just biography, it is an argument about what security truly means in a world obsessed with class and optics. Inside the hospital, the most haunting element is not the confinement itself, but what it did to her sense of self. One widely repeated account claims that when asked about Gladys Deacon, she responded as if referring to a stranger, denying the name, rejecting the identity, suggesting that she did not exist. Even if memory and illness complicate the exact phrasing, the symbolic truth remains devastating. The woman the world once photographed, praised, and traded stories about ended by refusing to inhabit the persona that had been imposed on her. It is as if she reached the final act and chose the only control left, erasure. Meanwhile, the Duke died long before her, and Blenheim continued its public life, absorbing tourists and history as if nothing personal had ever happened inside its walls. That is another cold feature of aristocratic power. Estates outlive emotions. Institutions outlive women. Public heritage survives private ruin. In later years, records suggest she received visits, but the fact that her presence could become a footnote in the story of a palace reveals the cruel math of the class system. Even a duchess can become disposable once she no longer functions as an asset. So where exactly did Gladys's story break? At the moment she injected wax for a perfect profile? At the moment she decided a duke would save her? Or at the moment a society that worshipped beauty proved it had no compassion for the consequences of that worship? And if this is what old money does to one of its most celebrated icons, what chance did less famous women ever have? When Gladys Deacon's story is placed beside other old money tragedies, a pattern appears so consistent it feels like a blueprint rather than coincidence. The details change, different palaces, different fortunes, different headlines, but the underlying mechanics remain the same. Women are rewarded for being valuable, then punished the moment that value becomes inconvenient. In the early 1900s, Anna Gould's fortune was treated like a magnet for aristocratic predators. Society columns joked she was especially pretty when viewed through her dowry, and her husband, Count Boniface de Castellane, reportedly burned through millions to build a Versailles-style fantasy that made her marriage look like a museum exhibit rather than a partnership. Jenny Jerome, meanwhile, was swallowed by rumor. Stories about lovers multiplying until the numbers became a cruel joke, as if a woman's private life were a public ledger people could balance for entertainment. Arabella Huntingdon fought a different war. Rising from poverty into a dynasty, she used money to buy permanence through art collections, libraries, institutions. Yet even she faced the social contempt reserved for women who climbed too successfully. So what do these stories have in common with Gladys beyond their glittering names? They reveal that old money often operates like a closed ecosystem where women function as conduits. Conduits of cash into titles, conduits of beauty into status, conduits of heirs into legacy, conduits of scandal into newspaper sales.
The moment a conduit refuses to flow or cracks, society stops asking what broke it and starts asking how to hide it. That's exactly what happens to Gladys in the modern eye. Her paraffin decision reads like an early chapter of today's cosmetic industrial pipeline. An insecurity is identified, an ideal is advertised, a procedure promises control, and the consequences, psychological and physical, are paid privately, while the culture that created the pressure continues unchanged. The difference is technology, not psychology. Today, an algorithm replaces the society columnist. Most beautiful woman in Europe becomes a viral label, and the pressure to maintain a face that matches a fantasy becomes even more ruthless because the audience is endless and the judgment is constant. Rumor, too, has simply changed vehicles. The old world's whisper networks and newspaper columns are today's screenshots, clips, and comment wars. A Victorian 200 lovers myth is the ancestor of modern pylons where repetition becomes evidence. And the palace exile has its modern counterpart: social banishment, career erasure, the quiet closing of doors after a public embarrassment, cancel culture with aristocratic etiquette. The consequences extend beyond individual suffering. These cases show how class systems protect themselves by shifting blame downward. The duke remains historic, the estate remains heritage, the institution remains necessary, while the woman becomes unstable, difficult, tragic, or crazy, labels that keep the system clean. The gender double standard is the engine. Male power is framed as tradition, while female distress is framed as personal failure. Even in wealth, women are often denied the one thing that could have changed outcomes: autonomy over money, health decisions, public narrative, and exit strategies. The final consequence is the most chilling. Old money can survive almost anything because it knows how to turn human lives into stories, and stories into souvenirs. Blenheim endures. Gladys disappears. So has anything truly changed, or have we simply replaced dukes and gossip columns with brands and algorithms, and kept the same hunger to watch women rise, crack, and vanish?
If Gladys Deacon's life reads like an inevitable tragedy, the most useful question is not who is to blame, but what could have interrupted the pattern. Old money thrives when personal choices are made inside a cage of expectations: beauty as survival, marriage as elevation, silence as respectability. The first lesson is financial and legal autonomy, because dependence turns love into leverage. In many old money marriages, control of wealth decided everything: who could leave, who could negotiate, who had to endure. A modern parallel is simple: protect the ability to exit. Separate assets, clear contracts, trusted advisors who are loyal to the individual rather than the family brand. That is not cynicism, it is safety engineering in systems where status can become a trap. The second lesson is narrative control. Gladys was turned into a symbol: most beautiful, muse, duchess, and symbols are disposable. Today, controlling one's story means boundaries, refusing to perform perfection, limiting access to private life, and challenging rumors before they harden into truth. It also means recognizing that public admiration is not the same as real support. A million strangers praising an image cannot replace a few people protecting the person. Third is the cultural lesson: stop pricing women by surface metrics. Gladys's paraffin choice, whether fully documented in every detail or magnified by gossip, points to a pressure that still dominates the present. Beauty standards do not look like violence, but they create it indirectly, through fear, compulsive self-correction, and social punishment for aging or imperfection. The moral responsibility is shared. Media should not reward cruelty, audiences should not treat decline as entertainment, and institutions should not hide distress behind polite labels. Finally, there is the constructive lesson of legacy. Old money can be transformed when wealth is redirected from display to durability: education, public art, libraries, hospitals, protections for women who are financially cornered. Arabella Huntington turned power into institutions that outlived gossip. That is the healthier version of permanence. The core takeaway is stark. A palace cannot substitute for peace, a title cannot substitute for identity, and perfection cannot substitute for being safe. When a society confuses a woman's value with her usefulness to an image, the ending is rarely kind.
Gladys Deacon's story ends where old money prefers its uncomfortable truths to end. Quietly, administratively, behind doors that do not make headlines. She began as a symbol of everything elite society claimed to celebrate: beauty, intelligence, cultural magnetism, and she spent decades trying to convert that symbolic power into something permanent, a title, a palace, an identity no scandal could erase. But the irony is merciless. Old money can buy stone walls and restore dynasties, yet it cannot purchase a life that feels safe from the inside. And when the system stops benefiting from a woman's perfection, it often reclassifies her pain as a personal defect, then moves on as if the institution itself is innocent. The most haunting lesson is not simply that she suffered, but that she seemed to reject the very name the world had turned into a myth, an ending that feels like the final act of control in a life spent being controlled by standards, headlines, and expectations. Blenheim Palace remains a tourist landmark. The Duchess who once chased it became a rumor, then a shadow, then a file. That contrast is the real moral of old money. Empires preserve themselves by outliving the people they consume. So the question is not only what happened to Gladys Deacon, but what her life exposes about the bargain society keeps offering women. Be admired, but never be messy. Be valuable, but never be free. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more deep dives into the untold tragedies behind wealth and titles. Share this video with someone who thinks money guarantees happiness, and leave a comment. Was Gladys Deacon a victim of her era's beauty economy, or a strategist who made a fatal bet on power? Between status and selfhood, what would you choose if the cost of the palace was your own name?